I raised them. I loved them. And then my own son tried to take everything from me. My name doesn't matter much in this story. What matters is that I'm 63 years old. I live in a 2-bedroom house in Millbrook, Tennessee, and for the last 9 years, I have been a father all over again. Not because I planned it, not because anyone asked me the right way, but because one Thursday evening in October, my son pulled into my driveway, handed me 2 backpacks and a garbage bag full of children's clothes, kissed his kids on the top of their heads, and drove away. He said he'd be back in a month. That was 9 years ago. My granddaughter was 7 when he left her on my porch. My grandson was 4. He was still small enough that I could carry him on my hip. And that first night, when he cried himself to sleep asking for his daddy, I sat in the rocking chair my late wife used to love and I held him until the sun came up. I didn't sleep. I just held him and stared at the wall and tried to understand what kind of man leaves his children with a 60-year-old widower and disappears. My son had always been restless. Even as a boy, he couldn't sit still, couldn't stay in one place, couldn't keep a job or a woman or a promise for longer than it took the shine to wear off. His mother, God rest her, used to say he was born with his shoes already pointed toward the door. After she passed, he got worse, got into things I won't name here. The mother of his children left when my grandson was barely 2. And for a while my son seemed like he was trying. He really did. But trying wasn't enough, and October came, and he left. I called him the next morning. He answered, which surprised me. "Just need a little time to sort myself out," he said. "You know how to take care of kids, Pop. You raised me." I said that was debatable. He didn't laugh. He said he'd send money when he could. He never did. For the first year, I kept expecting him to show up. Every time a car slowed down on our road, I'd look up from whatever I was doing and feel something clench in my chest. Part of me hoping, part of me not. The kids asked about him constantly at first. My granddaughter would write him letters and leave them on the kitchen counter like I was supposed to mail them somewhere. I didn't have an address. I didn't have anything. Just 2 kids who needed school supplies and dentist appointments and someone to show up to their Christmas pageants. So I showed up. I retired early from the hardware supply company I'd worked at for 22 years. I cashed out part of my pension to cover the gaps. I drove my granddaughter to soccer practice every Saturday morning, even though my knees weren't what they used to be. I learned how to braid hair by watching videos on my phone at midnight. I went to every parent-teacher conference, every school play, every birthday party where I was the oldest adult in the room by a solid 20 years. I didn't complain. I didn't explain myself to anyone. I just did what needed doing. My neighbor across the road, a retired electrician everyone called Walt, became my closest friend during those years. Walt was 68, divorced twice, with a bad hip and a good heart and an opinion about everything. He'd come over for coffee most mornings and sit at my kitchen table while the kids ate breakfast, cracking jokes and sneaking them extra sugar when he thought I wasn't looking. He knew the full story. Walt was the only person in this world, other than those 2 children, who understood what my life actually looked like from the inside. By the time my granddaughter turned 16, she was a different person than the frightened little girl who'd shown up with a garbage bag of clothes. She was confident, sharp, funny. She made the honor roll. She had friends who actually came to the house and sat in my living room and laughed too loudly and ate everything in the refrigerator. My grandson, 13 by then, was quieter, but steadier. He liked to build things. He'd spend entire weekends taking apart old electronics and putting them back together in new configurations that somehow, mysteriously, worked better than before. I was proud of them every single day. Then my son came back. I didn't recognize him at first. It was a Tuesday in March, a school day, and I was out front raking the last of the winter leaves when a silver SUV I didn't know pulled up to the curb. The man who got out was heavier than I remembered, with a trimmed beard and new clothes that looked expensive. There was a woman with him, younger, dressed like she was going somewhere important, and there was a third person who stepped out last and stood by the car with a briefcase, and I knew from the way he stood that he was a lawyer. My son looked at me across the yard and said, "Hey, Pop." I held the rake with both hands. I didn't say anything. He said the kids were coming home with him. He said he'd gotten his life together, that he was clean, that he was married now, that he had a house in Phoenix with a yard and a good school district. He said all of this in the tone of someone announcing good news. His wife smiled in a way that didn't reach her eyes. The lawyer stayed by the car. I told him the kids were in school. He said that was fine. He'd wait. I told him he wasn't taking them anywhere. That's when the lawyer walked up. The lawyer's name was Hargrove, and he had the particular confidence of a man who charges by the hour. He handed me an envelope and explained, in very precise language, that my son was the legal parent of both children, that no formal custody arrangement had ever been established, and that my continued retention of the children in my home without parental consent could be characterized, legally speaking, as custodial interference. He used the word kidnapping twice. He said it carefully both times, like he was measuring how much it would hurt. It hurt plenty. I stood in my own front yard holding a rake and an envelope and tried to keep my hands from shaking. I told them to leave. My son looked at me with an expression I couldn't read. His wife looked at her phone. Hargrove said I had 5 days to arrange a voluntary transfer of the children, or they would involve law enforcement. They left. I went inside and sat at the kitchen table for a long time. Then I called Walt. Walt came over within 10 minutes. He sat across from me while I explained everything, and when I finished, he was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "That rat left those kids on your porch without so much as a permission slip, and now he's sending lawyers?" I said that was about the size of it. Walt asked if I had anything in writing from when my son left. Any note, any text message, anything at all. I thought about it. I went to my bedroom closet, to the shoebox on the top shelf where I kept important papers, the kids' birth certificates, their immunization records, school enrollment forms, all the paperwork I'd collected and organized over 9 years. And underneath all of it, in an envelope I hadn't opened in years because I'd been afraid to, was the note my son had written the night he left. It was handwritten on a piece of notebook paper, 3 short paragraphs. In it, he said he was leaving the kids in my care temporarily while he dealt with some personal matters. He wrote that he trusted me completely and gave me permission to make medical and educational decisions on their behalf. He signed it. He dated it. It wasn't a legal document, but it was something. I also remembered the voicemail. 2 weeks after he left, he'd called from a number I didn't recognize and left a message explaining that he was going to be gone longer than expected and that I should go ahead and enroll the kids in school. I had transferred phones twice since then, but I had never deleted that voicemail. I didn't know why I'd kept it. I think some part of me always knew this day might come. I showed Walt the note. He read it carefully, twice. "You need a lawyer," he said. I told him I'd already thought about that. The problem was money. Between pension, Social Security, and what was left in savings, I was managing, but only barely. A custody battle in family court wasn't something I'd budgeted for. Walt said he knew someone, a woman who'd helped his daughter through a divorce 3 years back. He said she was sharp, fair with her fees, and didn't like bullies. He made the call from my kitchen while I made coffee. Her name was Patricia Reeves, and she agreed to meet with me the next afternoon. Patricia was in her 50s, small and brisk. With reading glasses she was always taking on and off. She listened to everything I told her without interrupting. And when I finished, she asked 3 questions. Did I have the note? Did I have the voicemail? Did the children want to stay with me? I said yes to all 3. She said that the third one was the most important. She explained the situation plainly. Because there had never been a formal custody order, my son did technically retain parental rights. But 9 years of absence, combined with documented evidence of voluntary placement, combined with the children's own expressed wishes, especially my granddaughter, who was 16, and whose preference would carry significant weight with a judge, gave us a strong foundation. She filed for an emergency custody hearing and also petitioned to have my son's parental fitness evaluated before any transfer could take place. Hargrove called me 2 days later. He was less smooth on the phone than he'd been in person. He said that going to court would be expensive and painful for everyone, and suggested we could settle this cooperatively. He mentioned a figure. He said if I agreed to a peaceful transition of the children, my son would ensure I had regular visitation rights. I told him I would see him in court. That night, my granddaughter came home from school and found me at the kitchen table with a pile of documents and a look on my face that I apparently couldn't hide. She sat down across from me. She was 16, and she had her grandmother's eyes. And she looked at me the way only someone who has lived in your house for 9 years can look at you, like she could read everything I was thinking. She asked me what was happening. I told her the truth. I'd promised her a long time ago that I would always tell her the truth. She was quiet for a while. Then she said, "He's not taking us anywhere." I told her that was up to the court to decide. She said, "Then I'll tell the court myself." I started to say something about how she didn't need to worry about it, that I was handling it, that she should focus on school. She stopped me. She said, "Grandpa, I'm 16, not 6. I remember everything. I remember him leaving. I remember you crying in the kitchen when you thought we were asleep. I remember all of it. If they want to know what's best for us, I will tell them." I didn't argue with her after that. What happened next I wasn't prepared for. My son and Hargrove, apparently, had been busy. Within a week of the hearing being scheduled, 2 of my neighbors submitted written statements to the court, claiming that the children seemed isolated in my home and that I had discouraged contact with their father. I knew these neighbors. I'd waved to them across driveways for years. I had no idea what had been said to them or offered to them, but the statements were there in black and white. Patricia told me not to panic. She said character witnesses could be countered with other character witnesses. She asked me to make a list of everyone who had regular contact with the kids, teachers, coaches, family, friends. The list was long. I'd spent 9 years making sure those children were connected to the world, and the world had taken notice. Walt, when he heard about the neighbor statements, went very quiet in a way that was different from his usual quiet. He said he had some phone calls to make. I didn't ask him to explain. The night before the hearing, I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed and stared at the ceiling and thought about all the mornings I'd packed lunches and all the nights I'd helped with homework and all the times I'd sat in a waiting room at the pediatrician's office reading old magazines while one or both of those kids was being seen for an ear infection or a sprained ankle or the kind of ordinary childhood ailments that nobody ever writes down but that add up over 9 years into a life, a whole, complete, ordinary life that I had given them the only way I knew how, by simply refusing to stop showing up. The courthouse was a 40-minute drive. Walt insisted on driving me. He showed up at my house at 7 in the morning in a pressed shirt I'd never seen him wear before, and he drove without talking, which was unusual enough that I knew he understood how serious it was. Patricia met us outside the courtroom. She looked composed and prepared. She told me my granddaughter would be interviewed separately by a guardian ad litem before the hearing. She told me to answer every question directly and briefly. She told me not to look at my son's lawyer when he was speaking. I saw my son in the hallway outside the courtroom. He was with his wife and Hargrove. He looked at me for a moment, and I looked back. And I thought about the boy he'd been, the boy I'd coached in Little League, the boy who used to fall asleep on car rides home from the movies, the boy whose mother had loved so completely. I thought about how far he'd traveled from that boy to this hallway. Then I looked away. The hearing began. Hargrove presented first. He spoke about parental rights, about my son's rehabilitation, about the new home in Phoenix. He made my son sound like a man who had overcome adversity and was now simply trying to reconnect with his children. He mentioned the neighbor statements. He spoke calmly and fluently, and if I hadn't known the full story, I might have found him convincing. Then Patricia presented our side. She submitted the note. She submitted the voicemail, which had been transcribed and authenticated. She submitted 9 years of school records, medical records, sports registrations, all in my name. She submitted a letter from my granddaughter's soccer coach, who had known her for 6 years. She submitted a letter from my grandson's school counselor. She submitted statements from the parents of the kids' closest friends. Then she called my granddaughter to speak. I had not been in the room during the guardian ad litem interview, so I didn't know what my granddaughter had said. When she walked into the courtroom, I watched her settle into the chair across from the judge with the kind of composure that you don't teach a person. You can only live long enough to earn it. She folded her hands in her lap, and she looked at the judge, and she waited. The judge asked her where she wanted to live. She said, "With my grandfather. I've lived with him for 9 years. He is my parent. He has been my parent since I was 7 years old, and I don't think a piece of paper or a new house in Phoenix changes that." The judge asked if she had anything else she wanted to say. She said yes. She said that she remembered very clearly the night her father left. She said she had heard him talking to me in the kitchen. She said she had heard him say that he needed time and that I should look after them. She said she had spent years being angry about it, and then she had spent years getting over being angry about it, and now she just felt clear about what was true. She said, "My grandfather never once made me feel like I was a burden. That's not nothing." The courtroom was very quiet. My son's wife was looking at her lap. Hargrove was writing something on a legal pad with great attention. My son was looking at his daughter, and I couldn't tell from across the room what his face was doing, but I noticed that he didn't look away. The judge asked a few more questions and then called a brief recess. During the recess, Patricia came to find me in the hallway. She was carrying a folder, and she looked careful in the way that people look when they have something complicated to say. She said that during discovery, something had come out. Hargrove's firm had represented my son's wife in a previous legal matter involving an inheritance dispute, a dispute in which she had received a settlement. There was reason to believe that my son's return was connected, at least in part, to a provision in his late uncle's estate that had been recently activated. The provision was simple. If my son could demonstrate that he was a custodial parent before a certain date, he would be eligible for a trust distribution that had been held pending that condition. It wasn't the whole story. People are rarely simple enough to do things for only one reason. But it was part of the story, and Patricia had filed a motion to have it entered into the record. I stood in that hallway and thought about what it meant. My son had left 2 children on my porch because his life was falling apart. He had come back 9 years later, partly because there was money attached to having those children in his house by a specific date. And somewhere in the middle of all that, there were 2 kids who deserved better from everyone involved, including me. And I hoped that I had at least been the part of the equation that got something right. When we went back into the courtroom, the judge had clearly read what Patricia had filed. He looked at Hargrove for a long moment. Then he looked at my son. Then he said something that I will remember for the rest of my life. He said, "I've been doing this for 21 years, and I want to be very clear that when I make decisions about children, I make them based on what is best for the children, not what is most convenient for adults, not what satisfies legal technicalities. What is best for these children?" He paused. He said, "The record in front of me is unusually complete. 9 years of consistent, loving, documented care on the part of the petitioner. 2 children who are thriving academically, socially, and emotionally. A 16-year-old who spoke with more clarity and self-awareness than most adults I've met in this courtroom. And a set of circumstances around the respondent's sudden reappearance that I find, at minimum, worth examining further. He granted me emergency custody pending a full hearing. He ordered a formal parental fitness evaluation for my son. He also requested that the trust provision matter be referred to the probate court for review. Hargrove asked to approach the bench. The judge told him to sit down. Outside on the courthouse steps, Patricia shook my hand and said she was cautiously optimistic about the full hearing. Walt, who had been sitting in the back of the courtroom the entire time, came down the steps and patted me on the shoulder without saying anything. We stood there in the cold March air for a moment, the 3 of us, and I felt something loosen in my chest that I hadn't realized I'd been holding tight for weeks. I asked Walt how his hip was doing. He said it hurt like a son of a gun, but that he'd live. I told him I was buying dinner. He said it was about time. The full hearing took place 6 weeks later. By then, my son's lawyer had changed strategy. The trust provision, once exposed, had weakened the case considerably. The parental fitness evaluation had identified ongoing concerns. 3 of my granddaughter's teachers submitted letters to the court that were, Patricia said, among the most compelling she had ever seen in a custody matter. One of her teachers had known her for 4 years and wrote 2 pages about who she was as a student and a person. And the last paragraph of that letter began with the sentence, "This young woman did not become who she is by accident." My son did not fight the second hearing the way he'd fought the first. I don't know what happened between him and his wife, between him and Hargrove, between him and whatever part of himself still remembered being a boy in my house. I don't know, and I've stopped trying to know. What I know is that when the judge issued the final custody order, my son's attorney entered no objection. The judge granted me full legal guardianship of both children. He noted in the order that the children's expressed wishes, their established routines, and the documented history of their care all supported this outcome. He recommended that any future contact between my son and the children be subject to the children's own consent, given their ages. My granddaughter, when I told her, nodded like she had already known. My grandson, who had stayed quieter through all of it than I would have at his age, asked me if we were going to be okay. I told him we had been okay for 9 years, and I didn't see any reason that was about to change. He said, "Good," and went back to the circuit board he was working on. That weekend, Walt came over, and I made his favorite, which is a beef stew that takes most of the afternoon and fills the whole house with a smell that means winter is over and things are going to be fine. We ate at the kitchen table, all 4 of us. And my grandson explained to Walt in great detail exactly why the modification he'd made to a salvaged speaker was technically superior to the original design, and Walt listened with genuine interest, or at least a very convincing imitation of it. After dinner, I gave Walt an envelope. Inside was enough to cover 6 months of the physical therapy he'd been putting off because he said it was too expensive. He tried to give it back. I told him I would be deeply offended if he did. He looked at the envelope for a moment, and then put it in his shirt pocket and didn't say anything, which was how Walt expressed the things that mattered most to him. I think about my son sometimes, in the way you think about someone you love who has also hurt you, which is not a clean or simple kind of thinking. I hope he gets to know his children someday, on their terms, when they're ready. I hope the evaluation helped him. I hope his wife is kind to him, and that he is kind back. I hope all of that. But mostly I think about the Tuesday evening last spring when my granddaughter came home and found me sitting on the back porch, watching the light change in the field behind the house, and she sat down in the chair next to mine without asking if I wanted company, because after 9 years, she knew I always wanted her company, even when I thought I wanted to be alone. We sat there for a while, without talking. The air smelled like cut grass and distant rain. She said, "Are you okay?" I said I was more than okay. She said, "Good. Because Walt told me you cried in the parking lot after the first hearing." I said Walt had a very large mouth for a man with a bad hip. She laughed. It was her grandmother's laugh. That same bright, sudden thing. And it hit me the way it always hit me. Right in the middle of the chest. I had raised them. I had loved them. And nobody. Not a lawyer. Not a judge. Not the restless boy I'd raised who'd become a man I barely recognized. Nobody had been able to take that away. Because you cannot take away 9 years of packed lunches and braided hair and soccer Saturdays and midnight videos about braiding hair. You cannot undo the thing that is already done. You cannot unlove someone who has already been loved that completely. I know that now. In a way, I didn't know it before all this started. And I think, if I'm honest, that is the only thing worth knowing.